Good afternoon, everyone. It is Thursday, April 8th, 2021 at 1:01 p.m. and we are in the Joe N. Idolette Teacher Education Center reconvening the Application Review Committee per School Board Policy 9800. The microphones are on and please ensure that they remain on. We are streaming live and recording audio and video for the record. My name is Christina Jacobs and I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Systems Compliance, and I'll be serving as the chair for today's meeting. There's a sign-in sheet that should be going around. If you did not get to sign in, please ensure that you have signed in. The Application Review Committee is comprised of 20 members, 19 of which are voting members. The chair only votes in the event of a tie. The committee members are Christina Jacobs, Chair, Scott Bass, Kelly Basura, Robin Bethel, Jeffrey Carver, Kim Copeman, Ronald Fagan, Heather Holden, Jennifer Idolette, Gregory McDonald, Karen Mallitz, Dr. Daphne Matthews, Dr. Brian McMahon, Mary D. Mercado, Robert Michael, Richard Meyer, Tracy Simonton, Dr. Edwina Suit, John Teskey, and Nicholas Westenberger. All right, there are 16 voting members in attendance today. We have a quorum. At the end of discussion of each section, the voting members will vote by show of hands on whether each section meets, partially meets, or does not meet the standard. Since we have evaluated all the application sections, the voting members will vote to approve or deny the application in the same manner. Please introduce yourself and state your title for the record. We'll start with Mr. Greg McDonald.
Hello, Greg McDonald, Director of Technology Services.
Good afternoon, Robin Bethel, Director of Student Services.
Good afternoon, Dr. Daphne Matthews, Interim ESE Director.
Dr. Brian McMahon, Coordinator of Accountability and Research.
Kelly Basura, Director of Academic Success.
Heather Holden, Coordinator of Assessment and Virtual Education.
Kate Hollis, Legal Counsel for the School Board.
Scott Bass, Deputy Superintendent.
John Teskey, Director of Security.
Jennifer Idolette, Transportation Director.
Tracy Simonton, Director of Food and Nutrition.
Nick Westenberger, Director of Facilities.
Robert Michael, Director of Physical Plant.
Ron Fagan, Chief Financial Officer.
Kim Copeman, Director of Finance.
And we have one more team member joining us virtually.
Dr. Edwina Suit, Director of HR.
All right. Thank you. Matter Academy submitted a charter school application on February 1st, 2021 to the School District of Indian River County with an anticipated opening date of August 2022 in Point West Vero Beach area. Today we are here to review the application using the Florida High Quality Replication Evaluation Instrument, which you all have a copy of and have been working on as a criteria sheet. On March 11, 2021, this committee held an applicant capacity interview with Matter Academy and their education service provider, Academica. Matter Academy had the opportunity to introduce themselves to us, and then committee members had an opportunity to ask clarifying questions. Now we are tasked with reviewing the application section by section. On the evaluation instrument, you will notice the front page is where what we are ultimately completing. This is an overall recommendation to the superintendent for either approval or denial. Dr. Moore will then take that forward and make a recommendation to the school board as a school board agenda item. At that time, the school board will contemplate our work along with Dr. Moore's recommendation and then vote on whether to approve or deny this new charter school application. I want to begin by reviewing the evaluation instrument. This is the Model Florida Charter School Application High Performing Charter School Replication Evaluation Instrument. It has statutory requirements within it that the charter school must demonstrate. If you look at section 1, for example, the replication section should identify the high-performing system submitting the application, the high-performing school being replicated, and a description of how the proposed school will be substantially similar to the school being replicated. It then gives the statutory evaluation criteria. Number 1, evidence that the applicant's school and the school to be replicated, if different, are designated by the Commissioner of Education as a high-performing charter school. Number 2, evidence that the proposed school will be substantially similar to the high-performing school that is being replicated. Reviewers should base this determination on the response to this question as well as the applicant's proposed educational, organization, and business plans as described through the application. Number 3, evidence that the organization or individuals involved in the establishment and operation of the proposed school are significantly involved in the operation of the high-performing school that is being replicated. The instrument gives us the statutory reference and then the evaluation standard. I will read for the record the definition of each option. Meets the standard. The response reflects a thorough understanding of key issues and demonstrates capacity to open and operate a quality charter school. It addresses the topic with specific and accurate information that shows through preparation and presents a clear, realistic picture of how the school expects to operate. Partially meets the standard. The response addresses most of the criteria, but the responses lack meaningful detail and require important additional information. Does not meet the standard. The response lacks meaningful detail, demonstrates lack of preparation, or otherwise raises substantial concerns about the applicant's understanding of the issue in concept or ability to meet the requirement in practice. Does anybody have any questions about the criteria? Right. For the record, Mr. Rick Meyer just entered. He's the Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction. In considering the application, please remember the standards set forth in Florida Statute Section 1002.336 as follows. An application submitted by a high-performing charter school identified pursuant to Section 1002.331 or a high-performing charter school system identified pursuant to Section 1002.332 may be denied by the sponsor only if the sponsor demonstrates by clear and convincing evidence that 1, the application of a high-performing charter school does not materially comply with the requirements in paragraph A, or for a high-performing charter school system, the application does not materially comply with Section 1002.332(2)B. 2, the charter school proposed in the application does not materially comply with the requirements in paragraphs 9A through F, which are A, a charter school shall be non-sectarian in its programs, admission policies, employment practices, and operations. B, a charter school shall admit students as provided in subsection 10. C, a charter school shall be accountable to its sponsor for performance as provided in subsection 7. D, a charter school shall not charge tuition or registration fees except those fees normally charged by other public schools. However, a charter lab school may charge a student activity and service fee as authorized by Section 1002.325. E, a charter school shall meet all applicable state and local health, safety, and civil rights requirements. F, a charter school shall not violate the anti-discrimination provisions of Section 1000.05. 3, the proposed charter school's educational program does not substantially replicate that of an applicant or one of the applicant's high-performing charter schools. 4, the applicant has made a mere material misrepresentation or false statement or concealed an essential or material fact during the application process. Or 5, the proposed charter school's educational program and financial management practices do not materially comply with the requirements of this section. Material noncompliance is a failure to follow requirements or a violation of prohibitions applicable to charter school applications, which failure is quantitatively or qualitatively significant either individually or when aggregated with other noncompliance. An applicant is considered to be replicating a high-performing charter school if the proposed school is substantially similar to at least one of the applicant's high-performing charter schools, and the organization or individuals involved in the establishment and operation of the proposed school are significantly involved in the operation of the replicated school. Does anybody have any questions about the Florida State statute? Every member of the Application Review Committee has reviewed the entire application. However, when we get to each section, there will be experts, such as finance is the expert on the budget and financial management sections. When we get to those, I will give the experts the opportunities to share strengths, concerns, and additional questions first. Then I will open it up to any other committee member to share strengths or concerns or any other discussion. And then I will ask each committee member to score that section as meets, partially meets, or does not meet the standard, and I will document that. Whichever standard has the most votes will be the standard I will document as this committee's recommendation for that standard. Therefore, if we have 7 partials and 3 meets, I will record partially meets as the majority vote. After we have completed each section, we will take the overall results into consideration for a vote of each committee member's individual recommendation to approve or deny this charter school application. We will take this vote, and the majority vote will determine approval or denial. If there is a tie, we will reopen discussion and then take a second vote. If we remain at a tie, I reserve the right to break the tie as a chairperson. After the meeting, each department will create a single overall sheet of your notes from today and get that to Heather Holden by April 12th, 2021, for us to complete a packet for the board agenda and Dr. Moore. All right, we ready? Let's begin. Section 1, replication overview. Okay. In this section, the replication section should identify the high-performing system submitting the application, the high-performing school being replicated, and a description of how the proposed school will be substantially similar to the school being replicated. We all reviewed this section, so I will open the floor to discussion from committee members. And any committee member at this time.
I think my biggest concern as we listen to this section is the fact that they are replicating a school from a place in Miami that has a significantly more diverse population than in Point West. And so as you look towards what we're trying to do with our joint plan and the African American Achievement Plan, I'm just not sure that they are completely aware with what they're replicating, what they're moving into in Point West. So that's my biggest concern about this section, is their choice. Everything, they have all the paperwork to say that that school is a school that can be replicated. I'm just not sure it's the right school to replicate in a place like Point West where we're trying to come out of a desegregation order.
I also have concerns that that replication school is not just an elementary school. As I understood, the interview is an elementary and, I don't know if it's K to 12, but it was definitely not just elementary. There was, the principal was also the principal of a high school. And if someone had more details or remembered that better.
I have the minutes, I'll look and see if,
I don't know if that matters or not.
Any other feedback while we're looking for that information?
I don't see anything specifically referenced in the minutes about that. Let me
At
look
the
at the
very
letter as
end,
well.
because I believe it was under the section 12, the financial
Oh, they brought it up later, not during, okay.
management and oversight, yeah. The principal of the elementary is also the principal of the mid-high, so it's at least the principal, it might be a separate school, but the principal over the elementary school is also the principal of a middle and a high school.
Oh, yeah, that is noted in the minutes as part of their response. Because they
Any
talked about the shared cost with the middle and the high school for their elementary school.
Any other discussion?
I was just gonna look and see what the replication letter called it. Hold on. Almost there. Here's my first attachment. So the replication letter does not specifically say say which school grades are surfaced by Matter Academy East Charter of Miami. Just wanted to double check that.
Can I make a
Yes, Ms. Copeman?
I recall the question regarding the fund balance being drawn down, and they referenced that the middle school principal, which was also the same principal, was identifying needs in the elementary level for those students when they do move to middle school, and they were putting in programs in the elementary school, which was drawing down the fund balance.
Yes.
All right. If there's no other questions or feedback, discussion before we vote, I would like to refer you to the evaluation criteria on the evaluation instrument for section 1. I'll give you a minute to get there since it's our first time around. Please make sure you are reflecting those items with your vote. Raise your hand if you think this section meets the standard. You all can raise one more time so we can see. Yep, thank
That's
you.
correct. So 7, I need 7.
There, I see where it is. All right. Raise your hand if you think this section partially meets the standard.
So have 7?
All right, sorry. Thank you, Dr. Sue. And then raise your hand if you think this section does not meet the standard.
And Scott's out of the room at the moment, so, and Karen didn't come. Okay.
So we need to make note of that.
A section can tie, it's just a overlay.
Okay.
Oh, that's right, 8, I'm sorry, we're good.
8-4.
Partially meets.
The totals are 7 for meets the standard, 8 for partially meets the standard, and 0 for does not meet the standard. All right, on to section 2. Mission, guiding principles, and purpose. The mission, guiding principles, and purpose section should indicate what the school intends to do, for whom, and then to what degree. We all reviewed this section, so I will open the floor to discussion from committee members.
Had a concern about the college readiness. That was a big part of their mission and vision. And trying to clarify how they measure college readiness at the elementary level. The response given was that they wore T-shirts, they talk about college, however, there was very little specificity as how they plan on replicating the college prep at the elementary level, which is concerning considering the replicating school is a K-12, so it's a little bit more, it's easier to kind of have that vertical alignment. With this just being an elementary school and a major part of their mission and vision to be college prep, there's very little substantive or practical, how is this going to be operationalized within the school environment?
Ms. Besserer?
In response to that same question, I do recall them saying that they...
Kelly, can you hold on one second, pull
Oh,
the mic
sorry.
in between.
In response to that as well, I do recall them mentioning that they also use the measure of the number of students receiving 4s and 5s and also completion of 5th grade. So just to follow up on that.
Thank you. Any other feedback, discussion? All right, if there's no further feedback, before we vote, I again would like to refer you to the evaluation criteria on the evaluation instrument for section 2. Please make sure you are reflecting those items with your vote. Raise your hand if you think this section meets the standard. Okay. Raise your hand if you think this section partially meets the standard. So seven. And raise your hand if you think this section does not meet the standard. The totals are 6 for meets the standard, 7 for partially meets the standard, and 2 for does not meet the standard. Now we'll move to section 3. Section 3 is educational program, curriculum, and instructional design. Curriculum and instruction, please give your input. I'm sorry, let me read the definition. The educational program design section should describe the educational foundation of the school and the teaching and learning strategies that will be employed. Now, please provide your feedback, curriculum, and instruction.
One of the areas that I took some notes on was the limited conversation regarding the transition to the best standards and how that relates to curriculum. Their responses to those questions were extremely limited in their scope.
Any other feedback from curriculum and instruction? Mr. Meyer?
So one of my biggest concerns was the adoption of the curriculum for the new standards, and I asked that question directly to the individuals that were on the call, and they gave the assurance that they would be adopting the same curriculum that we would be doing. I also had concerns about the K-12 research-based reading plan and the identification of students that would be needing interventions, and they gave the assurance that they would follow our plan as well. Ms. Becerra asked about required instruction, something that they're not required to do, to my knowledge, as a charter school, but they also gave the assurance that they would be doing that. So, you know, while the application itself is, I'm not going to use the word vague, but it's, you know, somewhat limited, as Ms. Becerra said, and what it's saying is not, you know, extremely comprehensive. It meets, in my opinion, minimum standards of what you would expect from responses. So, like I said, I don't know if this is a time where I would say, if they're doing the same curriculum that we're doing and they're doing the same reading plan that we're doing, I don't know what they're doing that's different, but they're saying that they're going to do what we do. So that's my input for that.
All right, thank you. Now I'll open up the floor for discussion from other committee members.
There was absolutely no information on how the school planned on addressing the federally mandated joint plan or the African American Achievement Plan. There was no information there about achievement gap. There were some goals for it, but no real specific instruction as to how they plan on adhering to those two. I would second the idea, the question was asked, how do you plan on transitioning to the best standards? And the response was, we don't have a plan, but we will. And so that was very vague. And then finally, the application does speak to annual measurable objectives as part of the federal requirements for subgroups. That has not been in play for several years. We are now under the ESSA requirements. When asked about that, they simply said they'll do what's required. but it was clear there was no institutional knowledge as to what is required in that regard. And so I would be very concerned about their ability to meet the instructional and academic needs of all subgroups.
Any other discussion?
They were
McDonald?
asked about their least restrictive environment policies. That was very vague, if any answer whatsoever to serve our ESC population, so.
Any other discussion? All right. Before we vote, I would like to again refer you to the evaluation criteria on the evaluation instrument for Section 3. Please make sure you are reflecting those items with your vote. Raise your hand if you think this section meets the standard. Raise your hand if you think this section partially meets the standard. And then raise your hand if you think this section does not meet the standard. The totals are 0 for meets the standard, 12 for partially meets the standard, and 3 for does not meet the standard. Section 4, Student Performance, Assessment, and Evaluation. The Student Performance, Assessment, and Evaluation section should define what students attending the school should know and be able to do, and reflect how the academic progress of individual students, cohorts over time, and the school as a whole will be measured. Strategic Planning and Support Services, if you could please provide your input.
I felt that section wholly lacked in what we would expect from a school that is applying for a charter in our county. There's nothing regarding the African American Achievement Plan or the Joint Plan, as I stated earlier. They do have a section for the achievement gap. It does mention the joint plan, but it does not get into any kind of specific detailed analysis as to how they plan on evaluating those subgroups on a interim basis. The entire plan seemed to be more like a wait-and-see type attitude. We'll wait till the results come back, and then we'll decide whether we were successful or not. There was no discussion. One of their goals is learning goals or learning gains. They had a goal of at least 80% of students in grade 3 through 5 will make learning gains in the ELA and math statewide assessments. However, there was absolutely nothing as to how they plan on progress monitoring whether or not those students are on track to make gains or not. Again, that just seems to be like a wait and see type attitude. I was expecting a lot more specificity so that if students are achieving X, then Y will happen. There was very little mention as to the fourth bullet for the evaluation criteria. A proposed assessment plan is sufficient to determine whether students are making adequate progress. There was just nothing there. And there was one other piece. I'll go ahead and stop there for now.
May I add, just in looking it over as well, though it speaks to last year being a COVID year, if there's a high-performing school that we're replicating from another area, then I would assume that they had data prior to this. So I kept looking really kind of for some reference to that type of result in my view, and perhaps I overlooked it, but I didn't see anything that kind of showed me this is where we were, and these were the things we were able to perform and do. And so in replicating, this is our expectation.
Thank you.
Sorry, I do remember that last point, and it kind of speaks to that. In light of where we find ourselves with some students having not been in formalized education for an entire year, there's very little as to how they, and that's where I think the specificity really was lacking, is that we are in unprecedented times, and this is very generalized plan of action. There was really very little specificity for understanding where current students are when they come in and what are they going to do to address the needs of those students who are behind. And then also, and Ms. Becerra mentioned it earlier, their goals are off. They do mention high standards in mathematics as evidenced by scoring proficient or higher. Proficient is a level 4, satisfactory is a level 3, yet their data specifies level 3 and above. So there's a discrepancy. They're using the numbers for level 3 and above, but they're saying that they're going to evidence it by scoring a level 4 or above. So it does speak to a lack of understanding as to what the state does denote proficient and satisfactory. It's very concerning that if this is an application for a charter school that is college ready, that would be a very clear and distinct point that they would understand, and it was not clear. When I did clarify that during the questions, they again were lost as to what is proficient, what is satisfactory.
All right, now I'll open up the floor to discussion from other committee members.
Much to what Brian was just discussing, the other thing that I found a little concerning was in relation to the achievement gap, they addressed that with a parent satisfaction goal. And it was hard for me to see a through line to connect those two pieces. And really when pressed, they just couldn't answer that question.
Ms. Coatman?
And to add on to that, because I had the same note, they are saying the survey is they would ask what the parents want. That didn't really show that they had a plan in place for achievement gap.
Any other discussion?
I would be remiss in Ms. Malice is not here, but to her credit, I would say that she would probably address the fact that there's very little in concern to English language learners. As far as a specific plan as to assess, it would just be as needed, but there was very little in terms of specific, how are they going to address the needs of English language learners.
As well as the support for McKinney-Vento or other.
Could you say that again for me,
As
Ms. Beth?
well, from the same department, federal programs, as well as what more robust support would be in place for students that may fall under the crisis or McKinney-Vento area.
Any other discussion? Before we vote, I would like to refer you to the evaluation criteria on the evaluation instrument for Section 4. Please ensure that you are reflecting those items with your vote. Raise your hand if you think this section meets the standard. Raise your hand if you think this section partially meets the standard. And raise your hand if you think this section does not meet the standard. So it's 275.
Can the do not meet, raise your hand again? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
There we go. The totals are 2 for meets the standard, 7 for partially meets the standard, and 6 for does not meet the standard. Section 5, student recruitment and enrollment. The student recruitment and enrollment section should describe how the school will attract and enroll its student body. Strategic planning and support services, if you could please provide your input.
So I would say, for us, one of the biggest components is looking at their drive for parent participation, or the number of minority students that they are expecting to attend, knowing that our data will be reflective of the area that they're talking about, of it having a much lower minority population. My concern is, how exactly do they make inroads? There are not specifics listed. It's an overall general campaign, not specifics listed for engagement with specifics, specific community areas. And then the concern that as we talk about student recruitment and enrollment, the thought of the 80% plus parent participation need or desire there. I have concerns for that.
Any other commentary from SPSS?
So for the ESE section, just the verbiage written within the application, it is quite vague. I did make note and concern as to how ESE and ESOL services will be provided to the students. Very vague response. And I was most concerned about how they would be contracted out in case there was not an on-site person to provide those services.
I do have concerns also there in terms of the evaluation criteria, that their recruitment plan that will enable the school to attract its targeted population. Considering the location, considering the lack of transportation, I do have serious doubts as to the described verbiage in here will meet those needs. The enrollment admission process, open, fair, in accordance with applicable law. I can't speak to the latter point of being in accordance with applicable law, but as far as open and fair, I have serious reservations regarding how they plan to do the lottery. As they described it, they are going to do the lottery in waves, so they could theoretically get 100 students, accept all 100 students. If the capacity was, say, 100, then the next roll, if they had 10 more, conduct a lottery with those 10. Their lottery is not a complete lottery, it is simply in stages. And without those stages clearly articulated as to when and where, I do not think that it is open and fair. I also have concerns that if their plan is not going to meet their needs for the racial ethnic balance that they describe, why they can't give, and this is where the law I think might come in, I don't know, but why they can't give preferential placement in that lottery to certain populations to help meet the minimum percentages. So that was my thoughts.
Dr. J.
Now, yep.
I had the two comments on the back of Dr. McMahon there. The lottery process, they didn't really explain that very detail. Was it manual? Was it automated? How was it? They didn't get into the details. That raises concern. And then I said, okay, what if you can't meet your enrollment projections? What are you going to do? They didn't really have a good, clear answer. And they also didn't back it up by saying, oh, no, based upon my marketing plan to attract the students that I need to get in my school, we feel they didn't give me any degree of comfort that their strategy would work.
Any other discussion? All right.
Sorry, one more thing, just sorry. I'm reading through this. It's in, again, the third bullet for the evaluation criteria. Plan and process will likely result in the school meeting its enrollment projections. Just want to specify in that section, letter D, they do project to have 16% of ESE students and 5% of English language learners. There is nothing in here that articulates the plan or process that would result in those percentages. Zero.
All right. So before we vote, I would like to refer you to the evaluation criteria on the evaluation instrument for Section 5. Please make sure that you're reflecting those items as you vote. Raise your hand if you think this section meets the standard. Raise your hand if you think this section partially meets the standard. Raise your hand if you think this section does not meet the standard. The totals are 0 for meets the standard, 7 for partially meets the standard, and 8 for does not meet the standard. Our next section is Section 6, Management and Staffing. The Management and Staffing section should describe how the day-to-day administration of the school's operations will be structured and fulfilled. Human Capital and Operations, do you have any feedback?
I do have feedback. Dr. Jacobs?
Go ahead, Dr. Soup.
When we spoke with representatives from the school, they did not have a defined specific plan on how they would staff the school in accordance with the joint plan. When I read their information that they gave to us, it did not have any specifics as well. Upon questioning them, they said that they would make sure that their staff was diverse and complied with the joint plan. They did not have any specifics for us. I also have a concern about their staffing as far as custodial is concerned. They only have one custodian that they would have in the building, and so I would have some hesitation about what their backup would be if there was an issue with one custodian.
Thank you, Dr. Soup. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. The way they answered the question about custodian, what the custodian was going to be doing, it sounds like it's going to be a shared responsibility. The person would be doing security, custodial, and also doing maintenance repairs, which I don't think really is realistic.
Thank you. Anything else?
I felt it was very weak to piggyback on Dr. Suits. Their response to recruit minority staff members was very vague, and their response to supporting minority teachers was very generalized to all, and it was not specific to our minority teachers.
Other discussion?
They also didn't mention anything regarding the mentoring of specific African-American teachers supporting our plan.
Any other discussion? All right, before we vote, I again would like you to refer to the evaluation criteria on the instrument for Section 6. Please ensure you're reflecting those items with your vote. Please raise your hand if you think this section meets the standard. Raise your hand if you think this section partially meets the standard. And raise your hand if you believe this section does not meet the standard. The totals are 2 for meets the standard, 13 for partially meets the standard, and 0 for does not meet the standard. Section 7, Facilities. The Facilities section should provide an understanding of the school's anticipated facilities needs and how the school plans to meet those needs. Human Capital and Operations, do you have any feedback?
I think one of their strengths is they do have a site selected and they are permitted through Indian River County. They do have a realistic vision of what they need as far as facilities there. My only concern would be that the application indicated that they didn't have a site selected, when in fact they did have a site selected. But regardless of that, I feel that they're okay in terms of facility and site.
I would just like to piggyback on that. The whole concept when they reached out before I was even here in November was that they were going to take over, they would like to take over that Somerset place if they got approved because of the grant that was given. But there is absolutely, the only thing we're going on is their word as we interviewed them in the application interview. It's not in the application at all. So that is a concern. We're going on verbiage that we heard as opposed to them ever having voiced it in writing on the application.
Mr. Michael?
Yeah, my only concern also is they don't have a contingency for construction delays or even a plan for how they're going to address that, especially with the construction industry right now being so busy. It might be very difficult for them to open on time.
Right, any other feedback, discussion?
This was part of my review as well, and I'm just going to echo what was already said. The strength is that they do set forth a great, plan for locating and securing a facility, but they have indicated that they already have the facility identified, and, confirmed that it was the Point West areas currently for Somerset Academy. They stated they did not have a lease yet, but it would be negotiated, and that they're, ready to break ground. So again, just the concern of the conflicting information.
Thank you. Right. Before we vote, I would like to refer you to the evaluation criteria on the evaluation instrument for Section 7. Please make sure you're reflecting those items in your vote. Raise your hand if you think this section meets the standard. Did you get 5 or 6?
6.
Raise your hand if you think this section partially meets the standard.
Was your hand up then? Okay. 7, 8, Kim's done.
I have 9. So if you could please raise your hand again if you think this section partially meets the standard. Thank you. And raise your hand if you think this section does not meet the standard. We're missing a vote. All right. We are going to redo the vote because we are missing a vote. Raise your hand if you think this section meets the standard. Raise your hand if you think this section partially meets the standard. That's 9. And then raise your hand if you think this section does not meet the standard. The totals are 6 for meets the standard, 9 for partially meets the standard, and 0 for does not meet the standard. Section 8, Transportation Services. The transportation section should describe how the school will address these services for its student body. Human Capital and Operations, do you have any feedback?
I do. There was $0 budgeted, although there was a note of $250 per bus per day indicated as a note in the budget section. When asked about compliance with our Joint African American Achievement Plan or services for students with disability, their answers were very vague, even to the point of asking what they have defined as a reasonable distance to meet those requirements. There was no definitive answer, so questions asked were answered with very vague information, so it doesn't seem like they have a specific transportation plan.
Any other feedback from Human Capital and Operations?
I believe, didn't you already also ask them if they had somebody identified to contract with, and they did? Okay. I thought that was.
Any other committee members have input?
I felt this area, it was equally weak, considering in light of all the other sections, in light of their commitment to mirror the demographics of the district, their said commitment to adhere to the African American Achievement Plan, and then combine that with the location, knowing the county, knowing the demographics of the county, knowing the demographics of the area, knowing the small radius that they're willing to provide transportation. I have serious doubts as to whether their transportation plan would actually meet those needs. So,
I know this is not on them, but will our residents even want to drive that far to go to that school, to be a part of that population for them out of their comfort zone? Because we know that that's a barrier. And so the location becomes a barrier for meeting that need.
Any other discussion?
Not towards outright, well, as a part of the transportation, there's a portion earlier that was, that talked about the equitable and free before and after school opportunities. So that my thinking is, so does transportation pertain to that as well? So I just had a concern for how that may play out.
Thank you. Mr. Fagan?
Also, the transportation plan doesn't tie in with their projected enrollment plan. So if I'm going to have X number, you know you're going to have X number of your children in the ESE and et cetera, you're going to have something for those children. The plan didn't track in that same way.
I'd like to bring up one more point. In their application for ESE students, it does say that the school will provide the sponsor, the name information, a sponsor-approved private transportation firm. I don't know if that's anything that we currently have in place. I worry about insurance. I worry about if they're truly going to meet the needs of or their goal is 16% ESE students. Now, obviously, all of them need transportation, but if there are students who do need that, other than just a sentence saying that they would provide it, in light of Ms. Idlet's point that they have $0 budget for this, I have serious concerns that this is a reasonable transportation plan that would serve all eligible students.
Any other feedback? Again, before we vote, I would like to refer you to the evaluation criteria on the evaluation instrument for Section 8. Please make sure you're reflecting those items with your vote. Raise your hand if you think this section meets the standard. Raise your hand if you think this section partially meets the standard. Raise your hand if you think this section does not meet the standard. The totals are 0 for meets the standard, 7 for partially meets the standard, and 8 for does not meet the standard. Section 9, food service. The food service section should describe how the school will address these services for its student body. Human capital and operations, do you have any feedback?
Yes, we do. So although the application addresses National School Lunch Program, the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010, and USDA dietary guidelines, it also addresses verification plans and the collection of free and reduced applications. Where my concern lies is at one point they discussed either they were going to provide the meals themselves or they were going to contract with the school district. But yet at the bottom of the food service page in the application, they're talking about contracting services, putting out a bid to solicit food. Is it going to be a bid process? Is it not going to be a bid process? It's not really clear how they're going to do that. My other concern was they stated 150 students would have one cafeteria staff member, and that's, in our world, that's very difficult to do. You need one person to serve the meals, you need another one operating the point of service, identifying that those meals are reimbursable. So operating with only one cafeteria staff member, I think will be very difficult.
Any other feedback from HCO? Any other discussion from other committee members?
I just second their conversation about staffing in that cafeteria. As a person who has spent a lot of time in cafeterias, seemed scary. Like one person in a cafe, I mean, I realize they probably would have administrative, but to try to run a healthy, safe kitchen and follow all those guidelines with one person for 150 possible meals does not seem plausible.
Other discussion? Before we vote, I would like to refer you to the evaluation criteria on the evaluation instrument for Section 9. Please ensure you're reflecting those items with your vote. Raise your hand if you think this section meets the standard. Raise your hand if you think this section partially meets the standard. And just for the record, raise your hand if you think this section does not meet the standard. The totals are 0 for meets the standard, 15 for partially meets the standard, and 0 for does not meet the standard. Section 10, School Safety and Security. The School Safety and Security section should provide a description of the school's plan to ensure the safety and security of its students and faculty. Human Capital and Operations, please provide your input.
Good afternoon, committee. Section 10, Safety and Security. I'll be referencing Section 10, page 43. One thing that jumped out at me right away, about 2 or 3 paragraphs down, within their documentation, they state security starts from the outside in. I do disagree with that. Security starts could be years in advance, months in advance, with planning, preparation, mental health training, coordination with law enforcement, contracts. These things were absent from the discussion with their personnel. I initially started off with asking them to explain security personnel, technology, and equipment and policies. I felt like one representative was doing all the answering and the rest of them lacked the background foundation for what they should know. They document within their language here on page 43, the safety and well-being of the students will be the #1 priority for all staff members. If that's the case, then any of those staff members should have been able to answer any of those questions at any time. But they kept referencing back to their one gentleman who at one point felt he was briefing someone in St. Lucie County. So he actually was incorrect with what county the school would be located in. And that's very important because each sheriff has different governing rules and bodies based upon jurisdiction and how safety and security is designated. My specific questions to them dealt with who would be adhering to Senate Bill 7026 and 7030, and their response was, well, we'll follow through with what the district is doing, or we'll carry through with what's already in place. And to me, that lacks the specificity of who is actually going to be protecting these students. What I was interested in hearing was X number of schools have guardians, X number of schools have law enforcement officers, X number of schools have school security personnel. We will work with the local sheriff, doing our homework prior to see what the local sheriff in Indian River County has approved for guardian training. They lacked that. They were not able to answer those specific questions. Another concern I had is in the attachment sections in the table of contents, if you notice, none of the attachments pertain to safety or security. There is not one piece of evidence or attachment in there that documents what their plan will be. And they actually cite multiple times that they're going to be using an active assailant response plan and civilian response plan to active shooter, the CRAZE acronym. They document they're going to be using youth mental health first aid, threat assessment teams, school-based safety teams. No evidence of that at all within the attachments. Nothing at all for me to preview. So there was nothing for me to preview from a security standpoint other than statutory language that I feel like they just downloaded and pieced together to present to us. It lacked substance. I would not be comfortable with opening a school with what I see here. And that was my point in the beginning is security doesn't start from the outside. It starts from prior planning leading up to a fence and a gate. A fence and a gate is one of the last things you want to look at. You want to look at all these other factors before you actually open the doors of a school. I was looking for MOU contracts with law enforcement, emergency response plans. I was looking for this organization's relationship with FEMA for emergency drills. Nothing there was documented at all from them. So from what I had to review, in my opinion, they do not meet the standard for school safety and security.
Any further discussion by other committee members?
And just knowing what this entails from the student services side, some of the extensive training that goes in place and the articulation between, I have great concerns about the day-to-day safety.
I think Mr. Teskey's comments were spot on, well said. As a parent of kids, I'd be very concerned just reading this and hearing the response. I understand that without an actual building in place, it's kind of hard to articulate some of that. However, considering that they're in Indian River County and didn't know that, that's very concerning. I understand there's not going to be a lot of detail, but getting the county right is huge. And it speaks to kind of that philosophy, and as Mr. Teskey pointed out, it kind of seemed like they just downloaded some stuff and put it on a paper. That was kind of my impression as well. I'm not an expert at it, but just kind of hearing their responses and hearing what they're talking about. There's nothing about single point of entry. There's not anything about fencing. The exterior security checks, signage, landscaping, exterior light, like that has not, I know it has something to do with safety, but that is a very generic, you'd have that regardless. You'd have that if you were a gas station, you'd have that if you were any kind of building. So nothing specific that we have been working on, that Mr. Teskey and his team have been working on over the last several years, considering today's kind of historic date or of significance. That's very concerning, that there would be not specifics in this plan.
Any other feedback or input?
I will just point out, as we go to read the evaluation criteria, it does say in what we're supposed to be voting on, that a fully developed plan will be completed upon approval of the application. And that's a state statement, that's not Matter Academy. But
I understand that.
Not that I'm not agreeing with your concerns, that is.
Yeah, and I read that, and maybe it's, whether it's a comment or a question, I don't know, but fully developed plan, and that's where I kind of was speaking to, not knowing the actual building and knowing where the entrance is. Okay, I understand that, but there's not a commitment to have a single point of entry. There's not a commitment to have X, all areas covered by cameras, or, I don't know, I'm speaking to a language I don't know, but there was just not very specificity of commitments for it.
One thing I'd like to remind everyone is, I too read that language, Heather. A fully developed plan will be completed upon approval. They actually cite in their documentation that they'll adopt what the district has in place. So how do they know what we're doing is correct? How do they know who John Teskey is? Why would they think it's correct? I feel like if they had done prior planning, reaching out and exploring what our plans are at the district and the sheriff's department, then I would buy off on, well, we'll finish our fully developed plan once we're approved. But since there is no documentation at all of any of the things that they have documented, I don't feel like they have a plan in place at all. I feel like they are just going to adopt what Indian River County has, and they, being good stewards of running and opening a school, should investigate what we are doing. That's my job. They should be challenging us to what our plan is, and that didn't happen. I wasn't questioned back from their staff, which I was expecting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. They could have at least replicated what they're doing in Miami or the other schools. That would have been something we could have looked at. to see how they're functioning in Dade or Broward County.
Any other feedback or discussion? Before we vote, I would like to refer you to the evaluation criteria on the evaluation instrument for Section 10. Please ensure that you are reflecting those items with your vote. Raise your hand if you think this section meets the standard. Raise your hand if you think this section partially meets the standard. And raise your hand if you think this section does not meet the standard.
Robin, did you just put your hand back?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So 0312. The totals are 0 for meets the standard, 3 for partially meets the standard, and 12 for does not meet the standard. Section 11, budget. The budget section should provide financial projections for the school over the term of its charter. Finance, please provide your input.
This is Ron Fagan, CFO. The documentations that they provided, they checked all the right boxes. They basically provided documentation with a projection of what their FTE is, estimated their revenue, estimated their expenditures to basically consume their revenue to where they'd basically use all the revenue to run their operation. Their projections are reasonable and customary based upon what they know, what the expenses are going to be in the county. However, a budget is a budget, it's a plan. The truth is in the pudding is when you get done at the end of the year where you are and how you're operating overall. So overall, on a budget standpoint, they provided the necessary documentation to say, I think I have a plan in motion and I should be able to work it out.
Okay, thank you. Any other input from finance?
Well, a couple of questions. I did ask them a couple of questions. They were supposed to give us a cash flow analysis beyond months leading up to the opening of school. They did supply something, but it was just another budget. It wasn't a cash flow. They were a little lax on how they were going to reduce capacity. If their capacity was less, their student enrollment was less than 414, what fixed costs were going to be reduced. They were reducing fixed cost in their budget. Well, if you got fixed cost, whether they have 100 kids or 500 kids, you still have your fixed cost. They didn't necessarily answer that question clearly, which meant they'd have to have a cash flow help from somebody. And then, of course, they didn't budget for transportation as well. Yep.
Any feedback from any other committee members?
Can I ask a question of finance?
Mm-hmm.
So the third bullet point says a sound plan to adjust the budget should revenues not materialize as planned. I know that you had asked about what if you don't meet the enrollment projections. My untrained ears basically seemed like they were just relying on this huge grant pot of money, that whatever shortfalls, they were just going to use that grant. I know with grants, they're very specific. They're not guaranteed always. That could go away after a year or 2 years. I don't know the specifics of this, but in your opinion, do you think that if they don't meet enrollments, will they be able to meet the financial requirements?
I would say yes, based on the overall organization. They have other resources above and beyond this one unit. And we'll get to that in the next section, that they have the financial resources. If this school was to not gain its enrollment it was expected, it would have a deficit cash flow, but it probably has the other resources which to keep it afloat. How long they were allowed to do that before they do something is unknown. But that was the question, how would you cover these costs? So my thing is, partially meets, that's a little heavy. To me, they do meet it because they dotted all the I's. The question is, can they really perform at that level? That I can't give you a solid projection at this point in time. Okay.
Any additional comments? Before we vote, I would like to refer you to the evaluation criteria on the evaluation instrument for Section 11. Please make sure you're reflecting those items with your vote. Raise your hand if you think this section meets the standard.
Yes, I
on that one?
yes.
Okay. Raise your hand if you think this section partially meets the standard. And raise your hand if you think this section does not meet the standard. The totals are 12 for meets the standard, 3 for partially meets the standard, and 0 for does not meet the standard. Section 12, financial management and oversight. The financial management and oversight section should describe how the school's finances will be managed and who will be responsible for the protection of student and financial records. Finance, do you have any feedback?
Yes, ma'am. On August 20th, 2020, the Matter Academy, Inc. had a bond rating from S&P. Bond rating is a triple B. This means this is investment grade, and this is where the additional resources, not only for this particular charter school, but for the enterprise as a whole, they have additional resources, but that would go beyond that one school. Outstanding debt is probably over $100 million. Globally, for the enterprise as a group, $155 million in revenue, $147 million in expenses. So earnings before anything else is they're throwing off about $17 million. So that's pretty solid. That's the other resources they possibly could use until the school becomes up and operational. The other thing was, we did ask a question about this one particular school that they picked. It had a nice fund balance of $4.3 million in 2016. And in 2020, it was $500,000. So that's a decrease of over 88% in those few years. When we asked the question as to why, they referred to something regarding the middle school and the high school was using these expenditures. The responses were vague as to what, where, and how come, and how are you doing it, and then what's it being used for. I didn't get a real clear answer on that. That is a concern that you can burn down that kind of a fund balance that fast. Unless you were to come back and tell me, well, the reason was in the beginning I only had 100 kids, second year I had 200, third 3, and I slowly began to match my revenue with expenditures, and so I was able to equal that and burn up my prior year fund balances. They didn't go into that, so I really don't know how they went from A to B. They're still positive, but I don't know why. I don't know what happened in those ingrams, and their numbers did not give me any information on that. So I don't know if they were going to continue this path and burn down another 200,000 or 300,000 and be in the hole, or if they balanced out, and now they're going to move forward. The other comment we had was, we asked a question about how were they going to have a financial recovery plan for the school, and there was no clear answer on that. Their health insurance seems reasonable and customary based upon our analysis as far as what they offered for their employees, and the replica school, I already talked about that part. Okay. That's all I have.
Any other feedback from committee members?
I would certainly rely on Mr. Fagan and his department's expertise, but I, kind of in light of that last question on the previous section and this one, I do have concerns about opening a school that they're replicating a school, at least the elementary side. The principal came on and said the reason why the fund balance went down is because of declining enrollment, because of the size of the location. Something that has considerable resources at their disposal. It seems odd to me that a charter school that is in the business of educating kids would voluntarily allow for, over the course of 5-6 years, a declining enrollment because of the size of the facility. I would have thought that if they have kids in their school and they all of a sudden don't have a classroom, which kids left? It's not like they said, hey, fourth grade, we're not going to have a fourth grade anymore. So I do have concerns about the long term. Again, I would rely on your expertise, but from this side of it, what if they have declining enrollment? What if they don't meet their projected numbers? Are we going to have a charter school here for 2-3 years and then shut down because they're bleeding cash? That would be my concern with this.
The other concern with that is if you build a facility for 500 or 600 children and you can only enroll 200 or 300, then what happens to the ultimate facility? And you've invested all those funds into that as well. And historically, based upon the present information presented, I can't tell historically if they've got any other schools that fell into that category and they were able to pull them out, or if there are currently ones in that same category. Did you project X number of students and you only have Y, And are you a cash drain or are you a cash cow? And then also the performance of those students as well.
Which is concerning, considering that they are replicating only one elementary school. The whole design, they're all secondary schools. So the one elementary that we're replicating is the one that has the declining enrollment.
Correct.
So is it a matter of location? Is it a matter of the program? Is it college prep? And maybe they're not fully fulfilling that at the elementary level.
Correct.
Any additional discussion?
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Just in that, I keep writing it over and over, having read that in our information, it's designed to be, I thought, a K-5, but I keep writing the question mark, is it K-8? Is it through high school? Because the parts I'm reading and looking at continue to say middle and high school further in the information.
The application is for a K-5 school. If you look at the very beginning, there is an overview for 5-year projected enrollment, and it only goes up to 5th grade.
Okay.
On cover sheet, page 2, it goes kindergarten through 5th grade.
Okay.
Somerset, that is already approved to go into that location, is projected as a K-8.
Okay.
But the school they're replicating, which is why you keep seeing a lot of that possibly in the application, is tied to a middle and a high school.
Okay, got it.
So it gets confusing because of those, but their application is for a K-5.
Got it, thank you.
Any other questions or discussion?
Is the site plan, the building, are they using Somerset's building? Because just to clarify, in light of that same statement, if Somerset was supposed to be a K-8, and this is just K-5?
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, they're using the Somerset, the site, as permitted, but it's a phased project. So they were gonna build a K-5 and then add an additional.
All right, before we vote, please refer to the evaluation criteria on the evaluation instrument for section 12. Please make sure you're reflecting those items with your vote. Raise your hand if you think this section meets the standard. Raise your hand if you think this section partially meets the standard. And raise your hand if you think this section does not meet the standard. The totals are 11 for meets the standard, 4 for partially meets the standard, and 0 for does not meet the standard. Now on to the addendum, education service providers. The ESP section should provide a rationale for contracting with the ESP, evidence of the ESP success in operating high-quality charter schools, the capacity of the ESP to successfully operate the school, and evidence that the governing board and ESP are able to operate free from conflicts of interest. Finance, do you have any input?
There was some vagueness in some of their with some of our answers to some of our questions. And then we had some questions from legal on some of the attachments regarding the governance and et cetera. But overall, their operations seem to meet the basic requirements for an educational service provider. Nothing glaring jumped out at me as being a deficiency.
Any other discussion?
We also got copies of the certificates of insurance, and they were in order.
A few comments on this. To their credit, the strengths, the applicant did provide the required attachment K, listing all the other charter schools, and stated that the governing board does not enter into a financing agreement with the ESP or any entity affiliated with the ESP. Of concern is that the applicant stated that it may lease its facilities from an entity that may be deemed to be affiliated with the ESP. They did state that the provisions of the lease will be independent from the existence, independent of the existence or status of the contract with the ESP and vice versa. including the absence of any cross-default terms in either document. There's no reference in the ESP agreement provided to any other contracts. And I'll talk more about the contract in a minute, but that contract does cover 24 other schools. The applicant did not provide adequate explanation as to how the governing board and the ESP will ensure arm's length performance-based relationship exists. The application does not provide for evaluations of the ESP, and that provides no assurance that the governing board is truly independent and capable of standing on its own without being wholly supported by the ESP. There's no clear plan for holding the ESP accountable for the negotiated performance. The application does not set forth a plan for continued operation of the school in the event of termination of the ESP contract. And the application does not provide an explanation of the due diligence efforts that led to the selection of the ESP. The application claims that the ESP was selected through a competitive process where cost and scope of services of the various providers in the field are compared. However, that statement is inaccurate because during the interview, the applicant stated, when I asked, how did you select your ESP? The applicant's response was, quote, "We select the ESP every 2 years, but it is reviewed every year." And that if the board is not satisfied, it will solicit other organizations. The applicant further stated that since it is a large charter organization, it has very good services from a large ESP. And my concern is that it's a bit confusing that the board purportedly selects the ESP every 2 years, but the current ESP contract is a 5-year term with 5-year renewals. So given its total dependence on the existing ESP for all of its schools, it's not clear how the governing board could fairly and impartially analyze the performance of the ESP. And as noted in the interview, the ESP contract attached to the application was a blank draft with an effective date of July 2017 and was with either this or another academic entity. And at the interview, the applicant confirmed that Matter Academy is under a master ESP contract to which this school would be added, and they did provide that contract following the interview. And that is an existing agreement with Academica Dade LLC, effective July 1, 2016 through June 30, 2021. So I did review that contract, which is an existing established ESP agreement covering 24 Matter schools, and it does set forth the terms and conditions, the grounds, procedures by which it may be renewed or terminated. Of concern, and this is certainly not their fault, that the agreement expires June 30, 2021. They did state at the interview that it's renegotiated upon expiration, so the contract that we reviewed may be renegotiated. There may be certain other terms. It says it will be renewed upon the then current terms and conditions. Again, there's no way, just based on timing, there's no way we know what the new agreement may hold. The agreement references compliance with, quote, "the sponsor's disclosure, verification, and affirmation fulfillment of board requirements form." And that is attached to the agreement. It appears to be specific to Miami-Dade County. All the other schools under that contract are Miami-Dade schools, but that is inapplicable, obviously, to an Indian River County school. It's not a form that we have that we would make our charter schools complete. So if this application is approved, and that's something that we need to be addressed in the contract. The termination rights in Section 24 apply to all of the schools listed on Exhibit B and provide that the ESP may terminate the agreement in its entirety for an individual school or for any number of schools. So if for some reason Matter Academy is in breach of the agreement and ESP decides to terminate as to another school, they could terminate the contract as a whole, and then they would be without the ESP. And as I previously noted, there's no performance evaluation measures such as school grades, academic achievement benchmarks, financial or enrollment targets. The ESP is only required to provide data. That's all I have.
Thank you. Ms. Bethel, I think you had?
No.
Okay. Any other discussion?
I have a question. If the site is selected, if the permit is done, how would they not know who's owning the property or leasing it? And this might be my own naivety, I just don't know.
I agree with you, and that was part of my questioning as to the facility, is if there was, you know, a lease or discussion of a lease in place already, and they did not have that, but I agree with you.
So who filed the permit?
That I don't know.
I can't give you that information for sure, but I'm assuming it was Somerset.
So would then Matter lease it from Somerset, or would that?
That's my assumption. But again, I don't know that.
Isn't that kind of a major kind of question?
Well, and that's, you know, that's something they identified in their application, but they did not further expand on it because their application was written as if they did not have the site identified.
Excuse me, I had a concern in that area as well, too, with the facility use agreement. If they lease out part of the facility, the cafeteria, the gym, who is actually the owner of the facility use agreement and then the property? From a risk standpoint with, we want to let someone use the theater and that type of thing. So that was not covered in the risk portion of their brief.
Mr. Fagan.
Okay, so what I've heard you said is the contract they submitted, they didn't have one, then they submitted one, but the one they submitted really doesn't and would not apply to us.
No, let me clarify. The one submitted with the application was clearly marked as draft and
Gotcha.
was definitely not
Okay.
what it would be. What they subsequently submitted is their current contract with Academica Dade, which they represented is the contract that Matter Academy Vero Beach would be added to. So
Okay.
that contract at the end has a list of all the schools to which it applies. And there are 24 schools, they are all Miami-Dade. There is also included as part of that contract, an Exhibit A, which is some sort of disclosure and form between each charter school and its sponsor, but the sponsor is Miami-Dade Public Schools. So that piece would not apply to us, and we would need to make sure that upon adding, you know, if this school were to be approved, upon adding Matter Academy Vero Beach to that ESP agreement, that's not something, you know, that's not something that's going to apply to us.
And there was a termination section in there that that the ESP could terminate one school or all schools,
Correct, or any number of schools.
or a number of schools.
Correct. I mean,
And it expires June 30th, 21.
correct, it's currently in a 5-year term, July 1, 2016 through June 30, 2021, and it shall be renewed for an additional renewal term of 5 years unless terminated by the board.
So.
And it'll be, excuse me, it will be renewed on the then current terms and conditions, which.
Which we don't know what they would
We
be.
don't, yeah, and that's not, you know, that's just the timing.
So therefore, we do not have a copy of a current the contract with the provider that includes any of we have a copy of something with Miami-Dade that they say we will be added to, but we
Well-
currently do not have something that has the same terms and conditions that would apply to us.
My understanding is these terms and conditions would apply to us. However, there is an exhibit
Exhibit
that Matter Academy, as a party to the contract, says, yes, we agree to be bound by this document, but it would need to say, except for Matter Academy Vero Beach, because that document does not apply to, you know, it's specific to Miami-Dade schools.
Could the ESB say, no, I don't want to have Indian River under us?
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
Could the provider say, I don't want to include the Indian River?
Sure,
I mean,
it's
could
their
think of-
negotiations. It's the negotiations between, you know, the ESP and Matter Academy.
I mean, they have that right, would appear.
It's contract, you know, whatever they negotiate. They represented, or at least I understood them to represent in the interview that, yes, you know, it is intended to be under the ESP, so, and I believe they had representatives from Academica on the call as well. So it seems that they've bought into it already.
All right. But the other side of the coin is that there's nothing in here that truly evaluates them,
Correct.
just a blank check.
Right.
Sign the document, and then off we go. Okay. And also questions regarding arm links transaction between the board and them. Understanding that role.
It's not very clear, you know, how they have the arms, like, because of how much the ESP does, which, you know, there's not necessarily a legal prohibition against that. It's just a concern of if the ESP terminates the contract, then what does the school, you know, what is their plan to continue to function?
It has, because it ultimately controls
A lot.
everything.
A lot.
All right.
It might be important to note that Somerset also uses Academica as their ESP. I don't know if anybody cares, but that's.
Any other discussion or questions? Before we vote, I'd like to refer you to the evaluation criteria on the evaluation instrument for the ESP addendum.
I have a question.
All right.
Kate, do you vote?
I do not. I have not been.
Can
I am not a
ask-
voting
Can I
member.
ask legal for a legal opinion?
Is it okay for?
Can I ask you a
Ask
legal?
the question, and
Okay.
I'll see if I can answer.
Based upon what you're saying, do they meet all the requirements, or is there too many vagueness in here? Or is it more of a management decision to say, oh, if you accept this, you have to understand there's no way to evaluate them, there's no evaluation period, so that's more of the management side, hey, do you sure you wanna agree to that? Or just be aware of that, or it creates a problem legally?
Sure. I think I would evaluate, or not evaluate, but say that this is similar to, as you said, with the budget section. I think all the information was provided that is required. I think, you know, you need to look through the evaluation criteria and see if what information provided meets this criteria. But they did provide the information. They explained their relationship with the ESP, and they provided the current contract. So whether that, there are no glaring holes of this, you know, if they had not provided the current contract, I would have a big concern.
Big hole, okay.
So I don't see that they did not provide information. I think it's about whether the information provided, you know, meets the criteria, and then, yes, I think it may lead more to a management decision of this
I
relationship.
understand what you're getting at. All right. Thank you.
Any other need for clarification, questions? Before we vote, I'd like to refer you to the evaluation criteria on the instrument for the ESP addendum. Please make sure you're reflecting those items with your vote. Raise your hand if you think this section meets the standard. Raise your hand if you think this section partially meets the standard. And raise your hand if you think this section does not meet the standard.
Robin, I missed, were you?
Meets.
Okay, thank you.
6 and 9. The totals are 6 for meets the standard, 9 for partially meets the standard, and 0 for does not meet the standard. Before we take the overall vote, let's review each section and see how the majority ranked the standard. Section 1, replication overview. I have partially meets the standard. Section 2, mission, guiding principles and purpose.
Can I, sorry,
Yes.
you're reading these, on our document we turn in, do we put hours or what the group rated?
You're going to put what you rated on the document you're going to email me. I have the overall ratings to share.
She was reading the overall, I didn't know if that's what I was supposed to check or not.
No, she's just reviewing it before
Thank
we
you.
vote.
Sorry.
Section 2, mission, guiding principles and purpose. I have partially meets the standard. Section 3, educational program, curriculum, and instructional design, I have partially meets the standard. Section 4, student performance, assessment, and evaluation, I have partially meets the standard. Section 5, student recruitment and enrollment, I have does not meet the standard. Section 6, management and staffing, I have partially meets the standard. Section 7, facilities, I have partially meets the standard. Section 8, transportation services, I have does not meet the standard. Section 9, food services, I have partially meets the standard. Section 10, school safety and security, I have does not meet the standard. Section 11, budget, I have meets the standard. Section 12, financial management and oversight, I have meets the standard. Addendum, educational service providers, I have partially meets the standard. We will now move on to vote on the overall recommendation to approve or deny the charter school application. This is not a situation where the majority of the ratings from all the sections will determine the final answer. Each committee member is to consider all items, the application, the capacity interview, today's discussions, the section ratings, to make an overall determination if you will recommend approval of this charter school. Does anybody need more time before we vote? Yes, Mr. Michael.
Just a quick question, and I don't know if you could answer it or not, but, so if we vote not to approve, do they come back and revise the application and we look at it again, or?
If the vote is to deny, then that, as stated in the beginning, that goes to the superintendent and then goes to the board. If the school board denies the application, the applicant has the right to appeal that denial. And then it would go through a court proceeding, or excuse me, a Board of Education proceeding to review the reasons for denial and whether there is clear and convincing evidence that the application fails to meet those statutory guidelines set forth that Dr. J, read at the beginning of the meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or clarifications before we vote? All right, I'm going to take a show of hands for approval or denial. We'll first take a show of hands for approval. Please raise your hand if you vote to approve the charter school application.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed those two right in the middle, I apologize. Jennifer and Tracy, I totally missed it, I apologize. 7.
Thank you. Please raise your hand to show denial of the charter school application. Eight denials, 7 approvals. The total is 8 denials and 7 approvals. The majority vote is for denial. Thank you, everyone, for your time and hard work. Please remember to fill out your evaluation tools with your notes from today and get them to Mrs. Holden by this Monday. This meeting is adjourned at 2:41 p.m. Thank you very much.